Hi everyone, it's Louise. I want to point out that this is a corrected video from the original. Thank you to Becky for pointing out that I made a calculation error in my first video of how to calculate resin mileage. I truly apologize for any confusion this might have caused, as my intentions are always to help. Hi everyone, it's Louise with Louise McCare, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different based on popular demand, I guess based on need. And over the last few months, I've been getting a lot of questions about how much resin you need to cover whatever it is that you're working on. Now, I can throw out a number for you. I can tell you what I use for my factor. I can tell you how much resin I think you'll need. But that's given my conditions here and what resin I'm using, which is the KS Resin Liquid Stone. You might be using much thinner resin or different resin that actually will spread out faster or farther or whatever. So in one of the videos I did back in March, it was a full tutorial, and it encompassed covering coasters from start to finish. I will link it above somewhere. And in that video, I referred to your resin mileage. And the resin mileage is talking about how far your resin will go to cover your pieces. So it's a factor that I end up coming up with after doing multitudes of resin projects, how far my resin will go per square inch. And that factor I use when I'm calculating for my next day's worth of resining I need to do. I need to do 2 Lazy Susans and 5 coasters. I calculate the square inches and I factor in my resin factor, and it tells me I can figure out how much resin I'm going to need to cover those projects. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. We're going to go over some simple calculations, and I'm going to go over an actual resining portion to give you a practical visual of how to do it, and we'll see what we come up with. And this is intended to just be instructional today, kind of like classroom, but hopefully it's going to give you the tools so that you can calculate your own resin that you need going forward for your projects. Okay, I'll be back in a second. So here's an example of where I have 4 coasters and 2 lids done. And then I have this one over here. That is one of my little suggestions, is that when you plan for your pour, you plan for what you want to do and always have an extra fallback position so that when you're in the middle of spreading out everything and how everything is looking, you decide, I've got a little extra here, I have enough for 1 coaster. That's what I always have a fallback position for. So I'm going to go over how much resin I used here. Matter of fact, I can just talk about it right now. I used on this 80 milliliters, and my intention was to do basically 5 coasters and 2 lids. I ended up doing 2 lids, 4 coasters, but I used 80 milliliters to cover all this. And so we can figure out a calculation on the mileage that works out to be. But like I say, it's probably best when you're first starting out to begin with a calculation of 15 milliliters per coaster. That will leave you a little extra, probably in the end once you get done with your creations. But if you plan on 15, just have an extra coaster on the side so that if you decide you're going to do 60 milliliters for 4 coasters, plan on 60, have a little extra on the side, and we'll see how your resin stacks up mileage-wise. If you have a little extra when you're done, put it on the other coaster. And I may have shown by now how much to put down in each coaster to make sure you get enough coverage. So hopefully that's enough little information that you can take with you and hopefully help you guys out. So you'll need some basic math skills to figure out the calculation. And in this case, I'm looking at a square and a rectangle for each coaster. So in this case, to determine the area of a square, I'm going to multiply one side by the other. So that's 4 1/4 times 4 1/4, which gives me an area of 18.06 square inches per tile. And since I have 4 tiles, I multiply times 4, which gives me a total area of 72 1/4 square inches. Now let's take a look at the jar lid. In the jar lid, since it is round, I'm going to use the area of a circle formula, which is pi r squared. Now don't let this scare you. It is a simple formula that you will need to calculate anything that's round. Your variable is r, which is the radius, which is half of your diameter. And for this hourglass jar lid, I'm using 2.3 inches as the radius. Please note, a regular straight-sided jar lid is not this big. And I arrive at this by taking the radius of the top and then add more from the sides. Because this is a strange shape, I add a little extra to the sides. So back to the formula. With 2.3 inches as r squared is 5.29 inches. From there, I can figure out the area of this circle by taking 5.29 times 3.14, and that equals 16.61 inches. And because I have two jar lids here, I double that for a total square inches of 33.22. So let's take a look at the math on that. With 4 tiles at 72.25 and 2 jar lids at 33.22, that's a total square inches of 105. And then from there, I know I used 80 milliliters for 105 square inches. So to figure out the mileage, I take the 80 milliliters, divide it by 105, and that gives me 0.762, which is my resin mileage, which is the amount of resin I need per square inch in milliliters. So knowing that, let's take a look at another example. Okay, so these pieces I resined yesterday when I got the idea I should do a resin measurement tutorial. Actually, and somebody even asked at the same time I was thinking about it about calculations. So I thought this is the right time to do this. So what I've got here is one of my scalloped Lazy Susans I just did and 2 coasters. So what I first do is I start by measuring the Lazy Susan, which in this case at the widest point it's 16 inches. Don't forget the side, which each side is a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to use for this factoring, 17 inches. And then these guys over here, everybody always says that they're 4 inches, but the coasters I use are actually 4 1/4. So it's 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. So I'm going to use those measurements in calculating how much resin to use. And just so you know, I ended up with 200 milliliters is what I used. But I'm going to go through the thought process and the calculations so you understand how I do it and share it with you so that you can then go to your resin that you're using and figure out what mileage you're getting with what you're due. Okay, I'll go through that here in a second. So once again, to get the area of a square, it's 4.25 times 4.25, which gives you 18.06. And with 2 coasters, it's 2 times 18.06 for a total of 36.12 square inches. And now let's look at the Lazy Susan. So for this Lazy Susan with a radius of 8.5, if you square that, it's 72.25 inches. So if the total area is 3.14 times 72.25 for a total square inch area of 226.8 square inches. So let's look at the math here. We have 2 coasters at 36 square inches, a Lazy Susan rounded up to 227, which gives us a total square inches of 263. So we know that we use 200 milliliters to cover 263 square inches. So to get our mileage, we take 200 milliliters divided by 263, which gives us a 0.76 milliliters per square inch. So in these 2 examples, I've established that I use 0.76 milliliters of resin for every square inch to cover my pieces. Let's take a look at another example going forward. So for this example here, where we're going to cover 4 coasters and 4 CDs, I'm just showing you the final mixing of the resin where you want to make sure that all the streaks are removed, following your manufacturer's instructions. And by the end of this, I'm going to ask you to figure out how much resin we need based on the calculation of the mileage that I've already established. And I'm showing you this so you can see how much resin I'm putting down on each piece so you can get an idea of how much you're going to need to put down when you're creating your own. So let's take a look at calculations here. Okay, so for today's examples, I'm going to use 2 basic shapes that I use all the time, a circle and a square. So this is a CD. This is going to be a clock. So the first thing I do is I go about measuring the diameter of the clock, which is 4 3/4. So I'll write that down. 4 3/4 inches. Now, for the CDs, the diameter is 4.75, which means the radius is 2.375. Going through all the math again, we're looking at 70.8 square inches for the 4 CDs. And we already know for 4 coasters, it's going to be a total of 72¼ square inches. So to calculate this, we're going to pretend we don't know how much resin we need, but we do know we need to cover 143.05 square inches, and our resin factor is 0.76. So once you've done several of your own resin creations and you've figured out what your resin mileage is, all you do is you take the square inches of what you need to resin times your resin mileage, and that will tell you how many milliliters of resin you need to cover the pieces you need to resin. And so since we know we have to cover 143.05 square inches using a resin factor of 0.76, we can calculate out that we need 108 milliliters of resin to cover all of these pieces. I'm just going to start pouring out my resin. Now I mixed just over 100 milliliters, 100 milliliters for these. It should be enough. If it's not, then I'll just, not do one of these. We'll see. Yeah. I pretty much know how far I should get with my mileage. So I'm going to keep the resin portion only focused on the coasters. But going back to the mileage, when I say mileage, I'm referring to how much resin you need to cover what you're trying to cover. So you need to be able to calculate how many square inches of material you're trying to cover, and then know how many milliliters of resin you need to cover it with. That is the mileage. So you pick it up. I always start from the inside, work my way to the corner. I start at one corner, and I know where I've started from, so I know where to come back to. I rub along the sides, and you'll know if you missed a spot because it'll feel like it's stuck. Your finger will get stuck. It won't ride smooth. So the resin actually is a nice glide. It glides along. And I just push it out, spread it out. Push it out, spread it on the corners and the sides. Push it out, get the corners, the sides, last side. I like to use my fingers because I can feel. And you're going to get air bubbles. Don't worry about them right now. They're going to come out in a minute. Once again, push it out. You can have it drip onto the next one if you want to save resin, so it's not just wasting. So push it out and get the side. Push it out, get the side. I'm going to throw in here that oftentimes your resin manufacturer will have their own resin calculator that you can use, given your shape and the amount of inches that you're trying to cover. I've found for me, it's always way too much resin, so that's why I came up with this way of calculating it for myself. You can use this if you want to, or use your manufacturer's suggestion. And you hold it up to the light. You can see if you got everything or not. Where you got to be careful is where there's air bubbles, because they'll pop. And then it might leave an empty spot. Gentle torch. You always keep your torch moving. And you'll see the bubbles just disappear. Lots and lots, hundreds of air bubbles. The heat helps it percolate up. I'm looking using the light as my reflection to see if there's anything in there. And there's nothing in there right now, but something will fall in, there's no doubt. Okay, so in the meantime, I'm going to clean up my cup and I'll be back. All right, everyone, so I'm trying to get to the end and recap this video for you, but stay tuned to the very end because I do have another key point to cover before we close for the day. But I'm hoping that the examples I provided will help you figure out what your resin mileage is so that you can calculate how much resin you need for your creations. But as we saw in the first 2 examples, you've got to be able to calculate the area and the square inches that you need to cover whether it's a square, rectangle, or circle. And hopefully I've given you a few examples here to show you how to calculate that out. And it's very important to be able to get to your resin mileage, because once you know your resin mileage, like we did in the last example, it's a very simple calculation to get from how much you need to cover and multiply it by your resin mileage to get how much resin you need to cover the pieces that you're going to be working on that day. And as I mentioned in the very first example, if you don't know how to do any of this and you've never done anything before, start with small pieces like the coasters. And I would say start with 15 milliliters on each coaster as a starting point until you can establish what your resin mileage is for yourself. The other thing is, with my resin, and we know that my resin mileage is 0.76, that is using the KS resin liquid stone, which is really thick viscosity. So my resin mileage might not be the same as what you're going to come up with. And while I'm mentioning KS resin, I'm going to plug here. If you go to my description, I do have a 10% discount code. If you want to use it, you'll help me out and you'll help you out by getting 10% off. I get 5% back in my future purchases of resin. But the point is, my resin is very thick and works like a champ, but my resin mileage might be different from yours depending on what resin you're using. That's why it's very, very important that you do several different resin projects to establish what your mileage is. So the most important thing is, when you're doing your resin, you must calculate in terms of volume. And if you haven't noticed, I work in milliliters because I like milliliters, and I'll show a cup right here. Because the millimeters has a very small scale. I really can get quite granular in the precision of my epoxy and hardener that I'm putting in the cup, so I can really get a good 1-to-1 ratio, versus using ounces is just a lot less precise, especially in a measuring cup. So I always go with milliliters. And you have to go by volume, but you can use ounces. So if you see the cup, you see ounces and milliliters, but that is by volume, because that is in the cylinder, that is in your measuring cup. Do not ever measure your resin by weight, whether you're using grams or milliliters. You don't ever put it on a scale and figure out what your resin is there, because you'll not get your right ratios of epoxy and resin. So always use the measuring cup, go by milliliters or by ounces. I prefer milliliters, and I just find it works best for me. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you're new here and haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, hit the bell and all. You'll get all my latest art tutorials. A thumbs up is also appreciated. And at the very end here, I'm going to link some of my creation videos, my playlists, so you can see some of the things that we've made over the course of time. So I think with that, I'm going to sign off for now. Hope you have a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, however you celebrate. Have a great time with your family and friends, and we'll see you next time.